I'm not going to bore you with the details of what I've done over the last 2 weeks. I've mostly just taken a break and played video games, to be honest. But let's jump into the news. So Petra is coming really quickly, actually. May 7th. It's like, what, 10, 11 days away from today? That crept up really fast. And remember how I said to you guys on the refuels that these kind of 2 to 3 week quote-unquote delays absolutely mean nothing? Like, no one cares because it's really nothing. Like, Petra is not a quote-unquote urgent upgrade that's going to, suddenly moon ETH to 10K or make Ethereum like 100 times more scalable or anything like that. These upgrades are incremental things. Even the major upgrades, you could say like the merge, for example, was an incremental thing towards that kind of full vision of Ethereum that we're all trying to build here. But yeah, it's coming May 7th. If you haven't updated your nodes yet, you should go ahead and do that. Update your clients, your execution layer and consensus layer clients. All the releases are out there for you. You can go check out this post from Tim Byko as well, officially kind of announcing the date of the fork here. I'll link that in the YouTube description below. But just a refresher as well, guys. Like, Petra includes a bunch of exciting updates, actually, upgrades, I should say, or EIPs, I should say. The first one, and probably the one that people are focused on most, I guess, like outside of the blob increase, because the blob increase to me is exciting, but it's like to be expected. Like, it's not anything that is controversial. Everyone wants more blobs and we're doing it, right? Outside of that, there's two things. One is the account abstraction EIP, which is going to actually be user facing. It's actually going to have a real impact on users. It relies on the wallets integrating it, but I'm sure the wallets will be fast to integrate it because it is a competitive advantage. And essentially what the account abstraction EIP does, well, at least the biggest thing it does, is get rid of that approve then swap flow that has plagued Ethereum for basically ever, like since Genesis, basically. So we're getting rid of that. And as I said, it does require support from wallets and such, but I'm expecting that support to roll out relatively quickly. The second thing is the max EB increase, where you can stake more than 32 ETH per validator up to a maximum of 2048 ETH. This is not direct user facing, but this is really good for solo stakers, home stakers, rocket pool node operators, and so on and so forth there. I'm super excited for it. I really want to roll all of my stake into a single validator. And then from there, I can basically just, the network basically has the same economic security, but I've got a validator there, a single validator there. And then what I can do is auto compound my rewards, which is great because right now, obviously every solo validator or every kind of like staking operation has to wait until they have another 32 ETH in order to spin up another validator and start earning rewards on it. So even if you have 31 ETH today, right? Say you've got 10 validators and then you've got another 31 ETH that you want to stake, you can't actually do that as a solo staker. Sure, you can go into a staking pool and so on and so forth, but as a solo staker, you actually have to wait to get the 32 ETH there. And I'm talking true solo staking. Obviously, there's other ways to solo stake these days, but true solo staking you have to wait. So that's really cool for auto compounding, and it also takes a networking load off the network too. And I'm going to be really curious to see how many validators get consolidated down and so on and so forth. I do suspect there's going to be a little bit of FUD around this because people are a bit silly where they're going to look at the, I guess, validator count coming down and think that, oh my god, what happened? Why did Ethereum just lose like 100,000 validators? When, as you guys know and are well aware of by now, counting validators is irrelevant. We should be counting the individual node operators because one node operator can be responsible for many validators, and it basically gives the same amount of, I guess, security from the node operator perspective. Obviously, the economic security perspective is different here, but yeah, just because we have 100,000 less validators because they were consolidated into down to validators with 2048 ETH on them doesn't mean that that we have less security. Doesn't mean that we have less node operators on the network. It's actually a positive. So I expect there to be some FUD around that, but it's pretty easy to dispel there. I hope the dashboards that show Ethereum staking related things make this clear for people. Otherwise, it's just going to be a really bad narrative that we're going to have to counter, which I guess is what we're experts in Ethereum land. It seems like every narrative is a bad narrative. But yeah, those are the three things there. The blob increase, account abstraction, and max EB. There are other EIPs as part of this upgrade as well, and you can read the full list here. I'll link this in the YouTube description below. But yeah, just reminder that Petra is coming up really, really quickly here. So the latest all core devs call, I think there were two of these that I've missed, but I'm just going to go off the latest one here, where the discussion was had not around Petra, obviously discussing Fusaka, and then even further than that with Glamsterdam. The main thing being discussed is not, I guess, like Peer Das, right? Because Peer Das is, again, relatively uncontroversial. People want it, everyone wants it. You know, it's not something that's going to be like kicked out of an upgrade because of controversy, for example. It may be kicked out of an upgrade because maybe it's considered not ready for Fusaka, but that doesn't seem to be the case here. But what has really been taking up all core dev calls lately have been the discussions around EOF. Now, I've talked about EOF for a long time on the refuel. I've said before that I'm relatively neutral on it. I'm not for or against it. Sometimes I kind of like ebb and flow between for and against depending on who I talk to. But I think based on the conversations over the last couple of days, especially if you've seen them on Twitter, I think at this point there is a very low chance EOF makes it into any upgrade. I feel like it's kind of dead in the water. And I know that there are people that have different opinions on this and think that, well, you know, it's been in development for so long, we shouldn't just discard it because of such and such reason, we should just include it. It's relatively low risk, which I guess other people argue that it's not relatively low risk, but it's there, it's done, we should just put it live. But the problem is not, I think, around risk and not around like security for the network and not around, you know, the work's already done. The problem is that, yes, the work's already done on the protocol side, but then to actually take advantage of EOF, the app developers and smart contract developers have to build with it. Now that means that all of the old contracts, at least from my understanding, all of the current contracts live on the network and all the old ones, they are not EOF contracts, right? To be an EOF contract, they would have to rewrite that and deploy it again. That's my understanding of it. I may be wrong here, but that's what I'm seeing from app devs. So I think this is, I guess, the main lesson from the EOF kind of debate that's raged on for a few years now, basically the whole EOF thing, is that there has traditionally been quite a disconnect between core developers and app developers. And I think this disconnect wasn't something done on purpose. I don't think that the core developers don't care about the app developers and vice versa. But in large kind of distributed and decentralized organizations like Ethereum, which we don't really have much to go on here, but when you look at the landscape in terms of the different kind of networks out there and different kind of initiatives out there, what tends to happen is that if there is no one kind of like leading an effort, it tends to just not happen. So, for example, if there was a leader, say someone that was connecting the app developers to the core developers and coordinating all of that, then this wouldn't have been an issue. But traditionally, there hasn't really been that. Now, those things are changing. The EF is definitely putting a much bigger emphasis on making sure that there is communication lines between the core developers and the app developers, but I think that that's the main lesson we can take away from this whole thing, because the app developers, you know, should have informed, or I guess like should have been able to inform the core developers early on that, hey, you know, this isn't necessarily something that we care for. It's, you know, it just adds more work to us because we have to rewrite our contracts, or, you know, when we're writing new contracts, yeah, okay, we can take advantage of it, but maybe it's not something that's worth focusing on versus something else. Now, as I said, there are a lot of different, I guess, positions and debates on this here. I am back to being neutral on it. I'm not for or against it, but given that it has become so controversial at this point, and it has become something that it seems like it seems like a lot of people don't want, I just don't see it going in. Like, this is the thing with EIPs, is that once they become controversial, it's really hard to actually get them included, and this, I guess, like, is true for all EIPs, but there are a lot of EIPs that inherently don't have any controversy attached to them. As I mentioned before with the blob related stuff, there is some controversy around that where people say, why are we scaling blobs when, you know, at current kind of scale with, current blob count, the fees going towards Ethereum are quite minimal, and that means that the L2s and rollups are free riding. And I understand that perspective, but that is less to do with blob scale and more to do with how blobs are priced. So again, like, it's not really controversy around the blobs and scaling the blobs up. It's more, we need another different EIP in order to fix the blob gas market, which is exactly what we have, and there's a few different efforts here, but that's an example of something that is relatively uncontroversial. But then there are things like, yeah, EOF, and I guess like the most controversial EIP I can think of, or one of the most, is ProgPal from back in the day. Then there was EIP, I believe it was 999, which was the parity unstuck funds one, which is basically a bailout EIP that was super controversial. So yeah, there's just inherently things that have controversy attached to them and things that don't. And I think with EOF, unfortunately for a lot of the devs that worked on this, it has become quite controversial, which means that it has a low chance of going into the network, especially when the wider community gets involved. That's when it becomes just extra noisy, and that's what we've seen here with EOF. But outside of that, things are still going well with getting Fusaka out the door. I believe work's still being done there, and then obviously Glamsterdam after that. But that's the latest on I guess like EOF and the latest core devs call. I think there's going to be a core devs call again. I mean, there will be again this week. I believe it's on Monday. That's going to be really interesting because it's going to be a lot about EOF. And I think on that call, it will be decided finally if EOF is dead or if it will still go in. If I was a betting man, I would put money on it being dead, to be honest. But we're going to have to see. It's going to be a spicy call, that's for sure. All right, moving on. So there's been a lot of talk about L1 scaling recently. Now, what I'm going to do is I have 4 tweets here that are related to L1 scaling, and then I have a tweet that I put out that summarizes all of it. So what I want to do is I want to cover this tweet from Justin Drake. So he basically put out a tweet where he said that we're going to get 1 gigagas per second on Ethereum L1 with ZK VMs, which equates to around 10,000 TPS. And we're not going to compromise to get there. This is the key thing that I think a lot of the community is debating, is basically people keep saying, we want to scale the L1, we want to scale the L1. And that's all well and good. Like, that's fine. Let's scale the L1. But the key is that we should not be compromising here. And what that means is that we should be able to do this, scaling the L1, but while keeping consumer hardware viable to run the network, while keeping home internet viable to run the network, right? While keeping censorship resistance with things like Fossil, while keeping 100% uptime with things like client diversity, and while having the current 8,000 consensus nodes that we have and potentially growing that even further. We shouldn't be scaling by doing it the way Solana does it, or Sui does it, or Aptos does it. These kind of L1 chains that are essentially data center chains. That is worthless to me. Like, that is absolutely worthless. I don't even care if people disagree with me on this. I truly believe that a data center chain is completely worthless long term. It just serves no purpose because, you know, I've been talking to a lot of people about this recently, and this is something that I've said on the Refuel from the very early days, and I think I even said this when I was doing ETH Hub with Eric when EOS was a thing, where if you optimize to be a data center chain, if you optimize to be more centralized, then what ends up happening is that you lose out to the other chains that just become even more centralized than you. It is a race to the bottom in terms of centralization, because what you do is you shift the Overton window here, where you basically show that to the market. You're like, well, you know, people are using my centralized chain, so you know, that must mean that the trade-offs that we made are worth something. It's like, okay, well, then now you've just shifted the window, and you're basically saying that, well, what if someone else comes along and makes another chain that is even more centralized and people use that? Does that mean that the market found value in that? I mean, sure, it does. But then what value prop do you now have? If you gave up on decentralization, if you made these trade-offs, and another chain comes along and says that, well, we've done that too, but hey, we're even more centralized, which means we've got cheaper fees and faster transactions, and, you know, we do all this good stuff in the background. We're a better chain because of that. Well, then people are just going to go use that thing. And now where are you left? You're left being not decentralized enough to be like a global neutral settlement layer like Ethereum is. And you're not centralized enough to compete with these other more centralized chains. So essentially you have you're at a crossroads here. You try to become more decentralized, which is, I believe, very, very, very difficult for L1s to do that have taken that trade-off space to begin with of becoming a data center chain, or you go down and down the path of becoming even more centralized. And again, that's just a race to the bottom. So from there, it becomes a question of, well, if you're just going to be like this super centralized chain, you're competing with a bunch of other super centralized chains, then you all look the same, and then the value prop really is nothing at that point. That's what I strongly believe. So when we talk about scaling the Ethereum L1, we cannot, under any circumstances, give up the decentralization that Ethereum has built over the last 10 years. We can't give that up. That is like essentially giving up. That would be like Bitcoin is giving up on the 21 million supply cap. That is what we hold most dear in Ethereum. So again, no one is against scaling the L1. They just do not want to scale it by sacrificing Ethereum's decentralization. And yes, maybe there is like 10% of decentralization that we can sacrifice in order to achieve a 100x increase in scale on the L1 and improvement of the L1 overall. That is a good trade-off. Don't get me wrong, right? That is actually a good trade-off. But I don't think there's actually a world where that exists. I think that we can keep making Ethereum more decentralized with other things, you know, like with better staking mechanisms, easier ways to run full nodes, easier ways to connect to the network via light clients, and so on and so forth, while also scaling up to what Justin outlines here of this kind of gigagas era, right? This 10,000 TPS on Ethereum L1. And this is just the L1, mind you. This isn't including the L2s. But of course, we are scaling the L1 for the L2s as well. So with all these discussions, I think what should be baked into any of the, I guess, like discussions around scaling the L1 is that we do it without compromise. So really, the tagline should be scale the L1 without compromising Ethereum's decentralization. Like, I know it's a bit longer than just, you know, saying just scale the L1, but it is a clearer tagline. And if you're saying just scale the L1, then it should be assumed that you're saying the latter part as well, that we're not going to compromise on Ethereum's decentralization here. So that's the first tweet there from Justin Drake. Now, getting to some more, I guess, like raw numbers here. So there was a new performance DevNet, or I guess performance net, spun up by the Nethermind team, I believe, with a bunch of execution layer and consensus layer clients, where they're essentially trying to push these clients to their limit in terms of what gas limit they can actually handle. Now, it turns out they can handle a really, really high gas limit. You can see here that the gas limits that's being supported by the performance net is currently 80 to 280 times that of Ethereum L1 mainnet. And this is actual real data, guys. This is not fudge data. This is real data. But I'm going to put the brakes on here for a sec, because while this is real data, it is not the same or equivalent data to what you get on Ethereum mainnet for two major reasons. One, this is not a hostile environment at all. This is a very controlled environment. It does not have to deal with anything. You know exactly what machines you're using. You know exactly what bandwidth you're getting. You know exactly who's running them, so on and so forth. Not a hostile environment, not a real world environment at all. And two, I mentioned that in one, but bandwidth. Bandwidth is the bottleneck here, guys. Like, the home internet connections are the bottleneck here. Because, as I mentioned earlier, when Ethereum is not a data center chain, we can't just say, oh, well, everyone has to have a 10 gigabits per second connection, right? No, that's not how it is. We are setting the kind of minimums and recommendeds for the Ethereum network, but they're nowhere near that amount. So bandwidth is always going to be the main constraint for Ethereum L1, or maybe not always, but it is going to be for the foreseeable future here until we maybe ZKify the L1 here. So I would take these numbers with a grain of salt in terms of real world performance. But what you can do is you can kind of make like a naive calculation here and say, okay, well, if in a controlled environment we get like an 80 to 200x increase in a safe increase in the gas limit in a controlled environment with the clients as they currently are, then can we get like a 10x increase on mainnet? So can we shoot the gas limit from the current 36 million to potentially 300 to 360 million gas limit? And it turns out from the discussions that I've had and from the other stuff that I've looked into, we can do that. It's going to be incremental. We're not going to do a 10x increase at once. That would be very dangerous and stupid to do that. But it's going to be incremental. But it turns out that we most likely could safely increase the gas limit by that amount there, which would be obviously really awesome for the network. And that is not the end of it. We can keep going from there. But yeah, I just wanted to highlight that while this is real data, it needs to be taken with a grain of salt. There's nuance here. You can't just say, okay, well, let's increase the gas limit by 100x. It's not how it works, unfortunately. I wish it worked like that, guys, but it is not how it works there. But you can check out that data for yourself. I'll link it in the YouTube description below for you to do so there. The second up here is related to that from Ben Adams, who works on Nethermind. You can see that there is a website you can go to called terragas.wtf, which is a website to have like a dashboard for live gas limit testing. Now, I believe this is just Nethermind. Just an effort from Nethermind here. It is connecting to other clients, but this is really showing what's going on from the Nethermind client here. It is quite technical. I mean, if you don't know what you're looking at, just looking at my screen right now, then you're probably not going to get much use out of this. But at the end of the day, I think having materials like this, having dashboards like this, tools like this is really important for essentially setting the standard that we are in scaling the L1 war mode now. You know, we've reprioritized it. I don't like the term pivot. I think reprioritized is better because a pivot implies that L1 scaling was never on the roadmap. It was, but for multiple reasons, it was not priority for the last like 3 to 4 years. And I think that I should, it's actually probably worth me explaining these reasons. I actually went through these reasons in the Daily Grade Discord channel, but the reason why the L1 in terms of scaling wasn't a high priority over the last 3 to 4 years was not because of L2s, really. I believe it was mostly because of the fact that we had other much higher priority things to do. So if you go back, let's rewind the clock. Let's go back to 2020. What was the main focus of even 2019 and 2020? It was getting the beacon chain out the door, right? That's what the core devs were focused on. That's what the researchers were focused on. And we got that out the door in December 1st of 2020. Okay, then what happened after that? What was the focus after that? Well, it was the merge, right? It was merging the consensus layer and the execution layer on top of still doing execution layer and consensus layer upgrades, which happened before the merge. Then the merge went live, September 2022, September 15th, 2022. But then, what was the focus after that, right? Or what was the focus, I guess, like during that period of time as well? Because this actually happened during the period. I should mention EIP 1559 first, right? Like this actually happened during the merge, like before the merge happened. But essentially, yeah, we had EIP 1559 go live as well, which is another big undertaking there. So the merge, and then after that, what did the focus shift to? Well, staking withdrawals, right? That was really, really important. We need to get that out the door. And then from there, the focus shifted to blobs, right? We got that out the door. And then from there, the focus has now shifted to L1 scaling, as on top of all the other stuff that we were doing as well, with blobs and peer DAOs and stuff like that. So I really struggle to call this a pivot, and I think that people are saying that not saying it's a pivot is like gaslighting. I just wrong, I believe, because to me, the term pivot implies, as I mentioned, that it is a complete change in strategy. It's like essentially going, well, we're going to, throw away all the work we did here because we think it's a bad strategy, we think it's a bad product, and we're going to pivot and doing this new strategy and this new product. No. L1 scaling has always been on the roadmap, at least since 2020. It just wasn't a priority. So that's why over the last few months, I've been trying to hit home that this is a reprioritization. We've basically said, well, now, we've neglected the L1 because of different priorities, but now we should really, really focus on the L1. So the pendulum has swung toward that. We've reprioritized that, and I would not call it a pivot. You guys can call it a pivot if you want. Like, I'm not going to tell you what it is and isn't, but I'm giving my reasoning as to why I'm not here. Because if you go back and listen to Refuels and even read my newsletters when I was doing them, there was always talk of L1 scaling during, I always talked about that sort of stuff. It just wasn't a priority at the time then. So yeah, anyway, you can go check this out. Link in the YouTube description below. Last thing, I just wanted to highlight this tweet from Josh Rudolph where he said, what's the near-term roadmap for scaling the L1? Like, what are we actually doing beyond gas limits increases? Well, we're doing 1 slot delayed execution, block level access list and state diffs, network level erasure coding, history expiry, gas repricings, and multi-dimensional gas and separate gas type for call data. All in the works, all have been in the works for a while. Again, this is nothing new, guys. It's been in the works for a while. We have actually been doing L1 scaling things during that kind of 3 to 4 year period. It's just that now it's at the forefront. Basically, we've reprioritized it, reprioritized talking about it as well, and now we're essentially, much more focused on it. So yeah, those are all the kind of like, I guess, L1 scaling and improvement related updates there. Now, I did put out a tweet just earlier where essentially I've been hearing, and you guys have been reading a lot about, why we want to scale the L1. I've basically been talking a lot about it on the Refuel over the last, year. I've been talking about it the last few minutes, right? Why we're actually scaling the L1. Oh, sorry, how we're actually scaling the L1. But not many people actually stop and think of why. And I'm not talking about the obvious reason of cheaper fees, more capacity at L1. That is obviously table stakes, right? Like everyone knows that scaling equates to cheaper fees and faster transaction, and more capacity. That's essentially what the baked-in definition is for the vast majority of people here. But I actually think that is nowhere near the most important reason to scale the L1. There are other reasons.